This video is going to provide an introduction into Legionella and the disease that the bacteria causes, specifically the species of Legionella bacteria called Legionella pneumophila. It exists in the environment. It's fairly widespread, but in low numbers in the environment, in water such as lakes, rivers and reservoirs, and it can cause an infection of the lungs. But in the environment it's not too much of a problem, because even though it's in these water sources that I've mentioned, it doesn't infect the human body because the way that it infects the human body is via inhalation. So you inhale, when you inhale water that's infected with Legionella bacteria, it goes down into the lungs and causes a particularly severe form of pneumonia. And the thing is, in the environment you don't really get many situations where you're able to inhale the water. In order to be able to inhale the water, it has to become an aerosol. It's not really too much of a problem, as I say, in the environment. It's when the water comes into a man-made water storage and distribution system that then becomes infected or provides the conditions favourable to Legionella growth, and then goes on to get turned into an aerosol somehow. So some examples of situations where an aerosol can be formed is things like cooling towers, shower systems, spa pools, and there are actually quite a few situations where aerosol can be formed, and the conditions that are favourable to growth can often occur in these different types of water systems as well. So what Legionella find favourable, the conditions that it can find favourable to growth, are the temperature of the water if it's between 20 and 45 degrees C, that's the temperature range where Legionella can multiply. Below 20 it's not able to multiply, but it's dormant, so it's not dead, and it could become reactivated if that water then heats up to above 20. Above sort of 50 and particularly above 60 degrees C, that actually kills Legionella bacteria off. So any sort of water that's between 20 and 45 degrees, that could potentially be the correct temperature to harbour Legionella bacteria, and particularly 37 degrees C is regarded as being an ideal temperature for the growth of Legionella bacteria. Other conditions it finds favourable are where there are sources of nutrition for the bacteria, for the Legionella bacteria, and it actually feeds off other bacteria, sludge, scale, organic matter in the water. Again, spa pools, cooling towers, hot and cold water storage and distribution systems could potentially harbour these or provide these kinds of conditions for Legionella to grow. Other conditions are where water is stored for long periods of time, or where the water is stagnant. So things like dead legs, which are sort of areas of pipework that lead to an outlet that's maybe never or rarely used, so the water will just sort of stand in there for potentially long periods of time, and that will allow the Legionella bacteria to multiply to potentially harmful levels. So these are the types of conditions to try and avoid in water systems, because if Legionella bacteria get into the water system and they find if they find conditions that are favourable to its growth, then it can start to colonise a system. And then if an aerosol then gets formed with that infected water, potentially then people could breathe that aerosol in. And what happens is the bacteria get inhaled along with the aerosol deep into the lungs. It goes down the windpipe, through the bronchioles, and right into the tiny microscopic little air sacs in the lungs that are called alveoli, that are responsible for taking oxygen out of the air that we breathe in and transferring it into the blood supply, whilst at the same time taking CO2 out of the blood supply and transferring it into the breath that we breathe out. Now, what Legionella bacteria do is they use the body's defence mechanism to its own advantage, because usually what happens is whenever there's foreign pollutants or infectious agents in that area of the body, there are what are called macrophages down in the alveolar macrophages, that are basically a type of white blood cell, and it comes along and it sort of envelops whatever the invader is, whether it's some dust or whether it's an infectious agent such as a harmful type of bacteria. It envelops it, it engulfs it, and it basically digests it and eliminates the threat. But with Legionella bacteria, what they're able to do is actually utilise these macrophages. So it gets enveloped and engulfed, but rather than being destroyed, Legionella bacteria actually use that macrophage to its own advantage, and it sort of takes over the macrophage, and it sort of actually gets protected now within the macrophage, and it starts to multiply within the macrophage. And once then it's started to multiply, it destroys the macrophage, sort of becomes motile. It develops a little tail that enables it to go off and basically attack other macrophages. And so there's a severe infection of the lung, pneumonia, but it's particularly severe, and it's got a mortality rate of 12%, which is assuming a healthy population. But in places like hospitals, for example, where people might be already immunocompromised and vulnerable and less able to fight off an infection, the mortality rate is much, much higher. So it's a very serious illness. Everyone's susceptible to it, but there's a certain section of the population that are more susceptible to others based on current statistics. They're people over 45, males more than females, statistically are more likely to develop the disease. Drinkers, smokers, people with existing respiratory illnesses or conditions that affect their ability to fight off infections, immunocompromised people. So what we'll cover in another video is we'll focus on how sparpools can manage the sparpool in the correct way in order to combat the threat, because of those conditions I mentioned earlier that Legionella find favourable, the temperature, the presence of nutrition such as biofilm, it's quite difficult to manage that in sparpools. It needs careful consideration, because the usual technique for killing Legionella bacteria is actually temperature, to boost the temperature up to well above 45. In hot water storage cylinders, the temperature should be above 60, and it should be piped from the hot water cylinder to the point of use so that it never goes below 50, and that kills off Legionella bacteria. Meanwhile, cold water storage systems should be colder than 20 to stop the Legionella bacteria from becoming active. But of course, in sparpools, there's no option to do that, because they operate at 37 degrees C, which, as I mentioned earlier, that's the perfect temperature for Legionella growth. So what we'll focus on, as I say, in a future video, is specifically how sparpools can manage the risk.